Welcome, everyone. Our mission statement, Merging Hearts is a nonprofit, driven educational cultural opportunity to nurture the mind, heal the body, and awaken the spirit. It is a safe place for the curious to develop spirituality through education, communication, and shared experiences of meditation, lectures, seminars, workshops, and publications. Let's go around and introduce ourselves. Those who know, I'm Maddie.
Mike.
Yeah. Dottie.
John.
Suzanne.
Casey. And Chris.
I'm going to go through the announcements. Tomorrow or Tuesday night is Chris Seeman in here live. If you haven't been here yet, you're just a good opportunity to get through it. It's very informative. Next Sunday is numerology with Pod. And on Wednesday, this Wednesday, is the Course in Miracles at 11:30 this building. And then Todd will be here with numerology on next Sunday. And then there's a healing chair also on the 10th. Here. And the following Sunday on the 15th is Reese Kaufman, Collective Energy. And also, that is Cassie and Lisa Lee with the UFO group. And then the 22nd is Ask It Basket. And the 29th is the Shoppers with Liz Adams. Anybody else?
I do. The end of May, I have sort of have a large sale here. I don't remember the exact date, but it's the end of May. So if you have anything you'd like to donate, keep it in there. They're accepting donations. There'll be more details after the meeting next week.
You know, I have something. I had a conversation with Shannon yesterday. So monthly, there is expressive arts and mindful movement, which isn't just going to be yoga. I'm hoping to get people to do dance and qigong or chi or just other things that are movement based. But we were talking about how cool it would be if Emerging Hearts community knew about that stuff too. So I don't know if there's going to be like cross marketing happening, but it's expressive arts is the second Wednesday of the month, and movement is the fourth Wednesday of the month.
We'll be sure to ask her about that.
So yeah,
Sounds good.
and even very this rumor of the century, like years fine.
Sure.
It's just something she brought up. It was like something's brewing here.
Okay, we respect others' opinions, although they may be different from ours. These are just some guidelines. Keep comments on point and never probably have something to say. Everyone has the right to be heard. Please keep a standard of confidentiality and do not irreverse. Please silence your cell phones. Were there any prayer requests?
I don't know how many of you know Jo Jean, but I heard that she just well wishes for her transition
On Wednesday.
just I don't know if there's going to be any don't know any information moving that up.
Yeah, I think Gary knows her sister's I looked for Facebook on Nathan's.
I did too.
I didn't see anything. So when she was in the hospital last year, we did those things. So somebody else knows anything. Okay. Let's have a short meditation before needs no stuff. settle down, take the deep breaths. And when I strike the bolt, I start and then the meter will go over the.
Thank you. And it's good to start out with meditation, actually, for this particular topic, because this is an essay that was written by a man who thinks science greatly. And it's not the sort of person you think about. Uh, so the expression servant leadership has become very kind of in vogue over the past 20, 30 years. It's almost slogan-like. There was a time when it was not there, though. There was a time when the concept of leadership was very different, at least in the corporate world, the corporate America. And what's really weird about this philosophy that we're talking about today is this came not from a Swami, a Zen master, or someone that we weren't expecting. It came from someone who worked for AT&T, mid-level manager at AT&T. His name was Robert Greenleaf. And in 1970, he writes this essay called "The Servant as Leader." Now, he was more than just a person manager. He was a deeply spiritual person. He was what he called a seeker. He had vague upbringing in various forms of Christianity, especially the Quaker movement. But he was definitely ecumenical, interreligious in his appetites. He wanted to see truth and insight everywhere. And this essay comes near the end of his life after a very long career becoming this influential figure within the largest organization in America at the time. And he develops this idea as something that could be applied outside of his own sphere of person management. He makes this claim that servant leadership is something that can be embraced by every human being in every role or every race position in life. So for him, he develops basically a management philosophy that is actually a spiritual philosophy. And this is quite explicit in his own writings. And it's amazing how many people, even in the business world, who adopted this model have started to integrate spiritual principles into what they teach. So what I want to do today is kind of introduce you to this essay that he wrote, give a little background of his life, and then throw out some interesting quotes that we could use for maybe reflection, because again, his claim is that this applies to all of us. And so the challenge today is seeing, do you see yourself in any of what he's talking about? Now, a little more context, the reason why I ended up working with this guy, working with his writing, rather, to death at the time I started looking, is that I was tasked with building a mission course for my institution, Walsh University, and our mission is to become leaders in service to others. And so I started to ask, well, where does that expression come from? I mean, I can find this idea in probably ancient spiritual philosophical traditions as well, but where does the language of servant leadership come from? And he's the one who actually coined the term a few years before this essay. So I said, well, I don't origin thing, so let's go look at that. So I became pretty familiar with this essay. I use it in class, but I wanted to find out more about who he was and where he came from. And so I finally got the biography, which came out about 10 years ago, and started reading it, and was amazed at all these connections in his life with so many of the things we talk here. Okay, so a bit of back, a couple definitions. So how does he use the word servant? He says it's not a service provider, it's not a martyr, it's not a slave. It is someone who consciously nurtures the mature growth of self, of other people, of institutions, and communities. This is done in response to the deepest guidance of spirit, not for personal grandiosity, not for personal gain. Servanthood is a function of motive, identity, and right action. So it's very much something bound up with an understanding of self and of community. He also used the term seeker quite a bit. He saw himself as a seeker. A seeker is someone who is not a mere achiever, one who sets goals and attains them in a straightforward fashion. A true seeker is open to experience from all quarters and follows a path without always knowing the destination. Okay, so here's the essay. You can actually purchase it. It's like $4. It's a PDF. You can get it from. He founded late in life, he founded what he called the Center for Ethical Leadership, which then he renamed after instead of the Green Center for Servant Leadership. But you get this, it's very accessible. So it's him at the end of his life. He passed away in 1993. So the background on him. So he was born exactly 332 miles away from where you are sitting here, Terre Haute, Indiana. During the Industrial Revolution, his father was a machinist, a union laborer, also became mayor of Terre Haute at one point. So he was basically a civic leader. He himself didn't know what he wanted to do with his life. He went to a technical college at first because that's what you did in the industrial age. If you were a man, you would go learn how to master machines and stuff like that. He was turned off by it. He didn't like it. So he ended up going to a liberal arts college under the influence of his uncle, who was an astronomer. He thought I would study astronomy because he had this experience when he looked at this telescope and saw the nebula, and he was just overwhelmed by this sense of spiritual awe. But then he realized he didn't want to do that as well because of all the science that went along with it. He liked science, but he wasn't a scientist. Uh, Around about the year 1926, when he was in this college, he had there was a lecture that was given by his economics professor, some guy named Helmy, and the context was, if you know anything about the early 20th century, this is the time of monopolies and mud racking journalism and stuff like this. His instructor says that he was saying, there's all this evidence that this company up in, I think it was up on Lake Geneva or something, is doing all these terrible things with their employees. You can get government to try to legislate against it. You might even be like a journalist who tries to expose it. Well, to change anything, that would just create more conflict. He says, what you need to do if you want to improve the world is you need to get inside of these organizations and change it from within, because you have the will to do so. And he was very impressed with this idea of changing something from within. And so he didn't know what he was going to do, but he knew that he wanted to join a large organization and be an agent of change within it. Now, if you know anything about what we now call ODL, Organizational Leadership and Development, that's sort of the field that's emerged out of this. It's the agent of change model. So there are two ways you can change something. You can either fire the whole staff and reboot it completely, or you can insert an agent of change into the existing culture of an organization and change it from within. So this is something that caught his attention. So he says, well, I'm just going to join the biggest corporation in the world. I'm going to join AT&T. AT&T at that time had subsidiaries called Bell corporations. Every state basically ran all of the communications technology, which was telephones and telegraphs at that time. So in 1926, he joins Ohio. So not only was the greatest organizational spiritual leader in business born a few hundred miles away, his first gig was actually putting up a phone wire in Youngstown. And he quickly rose through the ranks and became a supervisor of technical training. So now he was in charge of training people to be managers of various tasks. And he gradually became very, very effective at this about learning and teaching. In 1929, he was invited to AT&T headquarters in New York. And that's basically where he spent most of his professional career with personnel development. He wrote a whole bunch of stuff, all technical stuff about how to assess people, how to anticipate whether someone would be a good leader in a position. He also started to ask, well, what is a good leader? It's not the position that gives one the leadership, it's the internal characteristics that the person has. He says, you know a leader when everyone's already going to this person for help, even without any training. And so he started to apply this philosophy rather to the various elements within the corporation, and they started to embrace this in the way they hired people, the way they promoted people, educated people. So he never became an executive. He didn't want to be an executive because he wanted to be sort of this hidden force within the organization that would influence people who had the ability to make decisions. So a lot of the things that AT&T did actually were his ideas, but he didn't take credit for them. He left the presidents and so forth to do that. By the way, he also did the same thing with IBM. So when IBM became a public corporation, he was a large organizer of that too. Okay, so during the time when he is this personnel manager, he has to go all over the country and meet people and work with people. He also, living in New York, again, that's a very pretty intellectual hub at this time. He became involved with various spiritual movements. He became he analyzed the dreams with a Jungian analyst. There's all sorts of things that it was like all the stuff we do, he did. And in 1964, though, he retires early. No one wanted him to leave, but he decided it was time to do something else. He founded a Center for Applied Ethics and basically became a consultant for whoever wanted him to help. And if you read the mission statement of this Center for Ethics, it starts out with this very boilerplate language. We're here to make people efficient and all this, but then it has this twist. At the end, it says, by developing inward characteristics of spirituality through all the great religious and philosophical traditions of the world. So it was really innovative at the time. Finally, he writes this essay, The Servant as Leader. So we go back a few years to two important things he noticed in his life. First of all, in 1944, when he was 40 years old, he made this reflection in his diary. He says there are useful and necessary things to be done that are best done by old people, where he's just entering into middle age now. So he's thinking about this. It's not just that they have more perspective, but because the things that need to be done do not fit into a career, they are too risky for younger people. Look forward to old age as presenting an opportunity to be prepared for it, rather than as a time that you put out to pasture when one wears out. Begin now to prepare for what can best be done in old age. But what is that? He didn't know. He just said, I just prepared myself the way you keep your muscles in tone. You never know what you'll use them for, but you keep working on them so that they'll be there to need them. So he envisions a future for himself that is not just staying where he is, right? He uses the knowledge he's gained as an organizational manager, and he is asking, he's open to spirit, saying, what do I do with this? A few years later, this is when he's doing his Jungian dream analysis. The dream that he was talking with a squirrel in his dream, apparently. And the squirrel told him to write. It says, write for all seekers, but have powerful people in mind. People in business, politics, liturgy. But write, be universal. So again, he's written a lot already, but most of it's like, an instruction manual for managers or something. It's not something that the general public read. So Spirit was telling him, you need to change what you write. Okay, that was around 1958. Okay, so finally, in 1968, this is when he gets this idea. He reads this story. It's a novel. He was a novelist. I think he was Swiss, maybe Swiss or German. But he wrote a lot of spiritual novels. He wrote Siddhartha. Have you ever read that? Like in college, I read something. He wrote this one novel called Journey to the East. And this became the inspiration, so Greenleaf's looking for something. He's looking for a term, a catchphrase that he can use to orient his brain to one. So he reads this story. He says, in this story, we see a band of men on a mythical journey, probably also has his own journey. The central figure of the story is Leo, who accompanies the party as the servant, who does their menial chores, but who also sustains them with his spirit and his song. He's a person of extraordinary presence. All goes well until Leo disappears. Then the group falls into disarray and the journey is abandoned. They cannot make it without the servant, Leo. The narrator, one of the party, after some years of wandering, finds Leo and is taken into the order that sponsored the journey. There he discovers that Leo, whom he had known first as servant, is in fact the titular entity, its guiding spirit, great and good leader. Okay, so I actually ended up reading this novel about a year ago just to see what was in it. And it's very much this sort of esoteric type narrative. Even though it's called Journey to the East, they never leave Europe, actually. They get stuck in Europe somewhere. But it definitely reflects the turn of the century kind of, esoteric orders and things like that. When it said to the East, there's a place in the book that says East not so much as a direction, but East as towards origin, towards source, right? So these are people who are more seekers. Here's how he interpreted this. He says, to me, this story clearly says the great leader is seen as serving first. And that simple fact is the key to his greatness. Leo was actually the leader all the time, but he was the servant first because that was what he was, deep down inside. Leadership was bestowed upon someone who was by nature a servant. It was something given, assumed that could be taken away. But his servant nature was the real man, not the bestowed, not the assumed, not to be taken away. He was servant first. So when you think about Greenleaf's own life, he was doing this, all of his life in both his job, but also in other things that he did outside. he was being the servant, and it wasn't until he decided to found his own center for applied ethics that he, in a sense, assumed the role of leader. So I think he saw this in himself as well. Here's the actual passage from the novel that I wanted to read. It's a scene where the theme comes up. So the narrator, who is Tessa, is talking with the servant Leo before he disappears. And let's see, it says, I asked the servant Leo why it was that artists sometimes appeared to be only half alive, while their creation, their art, seemed so irrefutable. He looked at me, surprised at my question, at least the poodle he was holding, we're not sure why that, and says, it is just the same with mothers. When they have borne their children and given them milk and beauty and strength, they say to them that they themselves become invisible and no one asks them. Well, that's sad, he says. But Leo says, I don't think it's sadder than anything else. Perhaps it is sad yet also beautiful. The law ordains that it shall be so. The law, what law is that? The law of service. He who wishes to live long must serve, but he who wishes to rule does not live long. Then why do so many strive to rule? Because they don't understand. There are few who are born to be masters. They remain happy and healthy, but all others who have only become masters who endeavor to end in nothing. So this is really, it's a reflection on the nature of art, because he's a man. That in the story, it's thinking about creation. When we create things, when we're creative, we're giving life to something else, and we recede into the background. When we think of a famous painting, right? We can learn about this. Maybe that'll give us an insight into their work. What we're marveling at is this: what has been generated by the artists. So somehow this strikes a chord with me. It says, okay, this is not just about. It's not just about being on a quest. This is life, basically. This applies to everything. Okay, so the essay itself. So we're going to walk through it, just some of the main ideas. There's 4 parts to it. There's an introduction where he tries to give the big idea. He defines several characteristics of servant leadership, and that's where I want us to pause and think about, do we see those characteristics in our own lives? Because again, his goal is to say that this is all of us. He gives a couple examples, historical, and then he gives a conclusion about why this all matters, he says. And I think this is where it really becomes interesting, because you look at the characteristics that are generic, and you can find them in any spiritual tradition, right? But often we make spirituality it's just about me. It's just about me and my request to be myself or be one with source. He says that's only the starting. You only become yourself when you open out to others, when you create something outside yourself, right? So his conclusion is why this matters to human life. Okay, so here is his basic claim. He says, the question he tries to answer is, can the roles of servant and leader be fused into a real person in all levels of status of calling? Can Hess's reflection on art be true of everything everyone? And if so, can that person live and be productive in the real world of the present? He said Greenleaf was a very practical person. He would not sit on a mountaintop and he was very much involved in life. He says there's 2 alternatives to servant leadership. One he called revolution, and the other he called withdrawal. And he says many people choose these other paths because they're easier. So withdrawal basically means, you earn money, you get enough to live on, to live well, and then you go to your gated community, and as he puts, you go out to pasture then, right? And and what allows you to do that is that you're able to benefit from whatever the system is. You give them money, you get friends, whatever, just withdraw to your echo chamber. And of course, this is a big problem today, is that everyone's in their echo chamber. So that's really easy to do. Revolution. That's when you see the problem with society or the problem with the world, it's the system out there. The system is the problem. If we destroy the system, we can build a better one, right? Well, we see that today too, don't we? Right? Let's destroy everything. In the hopes something better will come in the future, he says. but often it doesn't. So he says that the challenge is, it's one thing just to seek to become your own person, to gain independence from tradition, as he says. But when you do that, people find it hard to convert themselves into affirmative builders of a better society. So he is interested in both the individual spiritual development of the person and the community that flows from them. This is a famous definition that he gives. So again, at the beginning, let me go back to the beginning, we can look at that definition that was given. A servant leader chooses to use his or her flaws, shadows, inadequacies, and paradoxes as key tools to harness personal and organizational potentials for a high mission need. Yeah, that sounds nice. How does he himself define it, though? He defines it not in terms of the word you used. He says that the test, which is difficult to administer, is this: do those served grow as persons? Do they, while being served, become healthier, wiser, freer, more autonomous, more likely themselves to become servants? So how do you know a servant leader when you see one? Well, he'll develop, become more servant-like. And then also he looks at the broader scheme, not just the small group of people that you affect. It's the effect on the least privileged society. Does the common good, is it harm or help you witness? And then comes the question, okay, that sounds good. Of course, we would like to have a positive impact on others. How do we know whether we're doing it? He says, as one goes to serve, how can one know this will be the result? And the answer, of course, is that one cannot know. We cannot know, right? We are finite beings. Ignorance, or at least lack of omniscience, is the human condition, right? And so for him, the servant leader is the one who constantly pauses and examines his or her, the impact of his or her functions, and then adjusts as necessary. Again, here's the manager of him thinking, does it actually have the outcome and so forth. And he calls this faith. He says faith is the choice, the nobler hypothesis. That's what it's doing this. One can never know the best path. The best that one can see when the choice is made, that is how one must live one's life. And since the test of results is usually long related, faith is that which sustains the choice of the noble hypothesis, the psychological self-insight. So here's where we have his reflective, internal notion of the path of the servant leader. This is the most dependable part of servants. Okay, so that's his introduction. He then talks about some characteristics. A lot of this was drawn from his own experience as a man. But it has to do with our thoughts, our words, and our deeds. Everything about us. We'll look through each of these, and here's where we're going to invite ourselves to identify if we experience this. Is this something that we try to cultivate in ourselves, or is something we see in others maybe? The first part is what he calls goal articulation. The leader, an attribute that puts him or her in a position to show the way for others, is that they're most that pointing the direction. As long as they're leading, they always have a goal, but the leader always knows what it is and can articulate it for those who are unsure. By clearly stating and restating the goal, the leader gives certainty and purpose to others who may have difficulty in achieving it for themselves. Okay, that's pretty abstract. Goals. Go outside the realm of organizational management. What are some goals that we have in life? Even if we don't know fully what they should be, but we're drawn towards something. How do we come to move in the direction of that form of life that we seek to live? What are some things that we do for ourselves? Do we keep a journal, for example? Do we do work to visually represent what we are seeking? Again, it could be performative art as well as visual art. What are things that we do to help understand and orient us towards our goal?
Surround yourselves with like-minded people.
Okay. Which could also be people who challenge us, right? What else?
So maybe outside of what you're saying, but so my ex-husband had this program, performance management, like I was reading about years ago.
Yeah.
You know, like clients, like parenting is like the biggest way that I saw this happen, and there's a lot of creativity in parenting because I never had a good example of parenting, so I'm letting love teach me through the love I have with my children intuitively to do it in a new way,
Yeah.
which is super creative. And my goal with that is for them to not be and to be empowered and to feel loved and secure and whatnot. So that was a big art for me with this. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me.
Because I fit like that.
And you might be starting with, oh, I don't want this to happen. I don't want this to be what people experience.
So this, who doesn't have any training, who's just listening and tuning. You know what I mean? Like, yeah.
And of course, anyone who's a
That
parent
was
will never can get training to do that.
right.
It's all intuitive.
It's all a learning process.
Yeah.
Love is the teacher in this phase too. Well, I guess frustration could be our my choice was to let love teaching in this phase
Right.
because it's so big.
I wonder too whether any kind of embodied kind of stuff, something that is something we do with our bodies that orients our bodies in particular ways. With that is a sub kind of goal articulation too. Especially if it is something that we do repeatedly, because we're orienting our bodies and our minds to see the world in a certain way. Right?
Yeah, I like the word repeatedly because when we talk about rules, because one ingredient that is helpful is discipline.
Yes. Yeah, and there's a big quote he's going to have later about knowing the difference between awareness and routine, and understanding that discipline and repetition are what create those synapses of here, and all that. Okay. Let's
No, right. First,
go.
talking that fascinates me actually. So in yoga, we don't have goals
Not goals as in I want to achieve something, but we're
because that's opposite of
So we have goals, but we're not chasing and focusing on them in the present moment.
right.
In the present moment, you do the work, but the work you choose might be because of a particular goal.
okay. Sure.
Right, because there's a good there's a paradox of the language here is that the goal is ultimately, as we'll see, the goal for him is internal. It's not something out there. But we can only do it. We can only reach that by sometimes, orienting the way we feel and think. Practices. Do we all have a practice that we use to ground ourselves, orient ourselves, remember who we always remember who we are almost? There's a lot of stuff I think that we do that does that. Okay, next one. Listening. Very important one. Only a true natural servant automatically responds to any problem by listening first. He talks about this in the context of he's using a managerial that you're assigned to a new team and they have a problem. So is your response to identify the problem and blame, or is it to listen first? When one is apparent, this disposition causes them to be seen and served first. The best test of whether we are communicating at this depth is to ask ourselves first, are we really listening? Are we listening to the one we want to communicate to? Is our basic attitude as we approach the confrontation one of wanting to understand? Again, the closest he came to any kind of affiliation with a spiritual community was with the Quakers. And if you know anything about the Quakers, they basically sit quietly until someone talks and then they have a discussion. But it's all about listening. Yeah.
I guess the thing that keeps coming to mind is like in her relationship to, he's with ANC, that's a corporation.
Right.
But there's an element of a lot of corporations that is exploiting and how often are you being able to listen? That takes a long time, So I think you have to start with the basic ethic of
of 9 people. But in an exploitative arrangement, you don't only value people only in so much as they can produce something for you.
Yeah, there was actually a study done at the time that he was looking at the Hawthorne studies. It was basically the last gasp, this kind of mechanistic understanding of management. The idea that people are cogs in a wheel, and the best way to get them to do what you need is to oil them properly, in a sense. But you pay them enough, and then they do their job. But he said, what it turned out, they said, they studied like a longitudinal study for 10 years. What are the factors that make people productive? It wasn't, the pay. It wasn't the working conditions. It was whether they were being valued, which included those things. And once this study was published, I think it was in the 50s, all big corporations except for 18, he said, that's of course, people need to know that. So there's a lot of pushback when this study came out, and he said, no, that's exactly what's going on. He had done this already in his own occupation in AT&T of trying to identify, putting people in charge of this, basically. Yeah.
And I think this comes from Adam Smith, where he talked about the iron law of wages. And it's like give people enough to exist upon, and that's it. And then all the rest is yours to keep. And there's something about that relationship that's like, I understand the point of, to me, it's like the person is not a means to an end, but they're ends in themselves. So in this case, you value them as beyond just what they can produce, which is very utilitarian.
Yes. Yeah, he once said that, I think a little later in the quote, says, listening builds strength in others. And remember, the measure of the servant leader is you build strength in others by the way you approach people. Right? Okay, next one. Experiential communication. A leader is one who must have facility, must have skill in tempting the hearer into a leap of imagination that connects the verbal concept to the hearer's own experience. Limitation on language for the communicator is that the hearer must make that leap of imagination. But the arts of communication is to say just enough to facilitate that leap. Think of how we use metaphors, how we use parables, how we use stories to explain something. Why do people like stories so much? Because it communicates with their experience, right? We love TV series that go into the lives of people who we can identify with somehow, or at least we can understand. So this becomes, it's common sense, but when we think about communication, how do we know that people are actually hearing what we're saying? So the listening leads also to an understanding of, do I need to communicate differently? Okay. Appropriate withdrawal. Like I said, one of the opposites of servant leadership is just to withdraw from society. He says there's a form of this called appropriate withdrawal. And it says the ability to withdraw and reorient oneself, if only for a moment, presumes that one has learned the art of systematic neglect to sort out the more important from the less important and the important from the urgent and intensely more important, even though there may be penalties and censure for the neglect of something else. Pacing oneself by appropriate withdrawal is one of the best approaches to making optimal use of resources. The servant as leader is constantly asked, how can I use myself to serve best? I think we can all identify this, right? Because we can't be constantly doing things. Right? Doing things for whatever goal, you can't hear or see yourself while you're busy doing things. That's why people stop. That's the whole point of contemplation, is to stop and reflect. And we're not doing something for a while. Right? So for him, this was a pretty important idea. Can we think of what do we do to withdraw periodically in order to recharge, to reorient ourselves towards what we're trying to become? It doesn't have to be with a job, even. It could be with anything. Or how do we withdraw? We identify this because most of my responsibilities require me to neglect responsibilities. I always have to figure out what can I neglect right now. Meditation. right? Anything that's we just did that at the beginning, right? We paused, we withdrew for a moment so that we could be more present. Empathetic acceptance. Okay, this seems to be a brainer for us. It was pretty revolutionary for 1950s guy here. The servant always accepts and empathizes, never rejects. The servant as leader always empathizes, always accepts the person, but sometimes refuses to accept the person's effort or performance as good enough. Acceptance of the person, though, requires a tolerance of imperfection. Anybody could be perfect people if there were any, but there aren't. Right? And this actually had a pretty profound impact on the way that he structured personnel evaluations. He says, you shouldn't be evaluating people's weaknesses because everyone has them. You should be evaluating what are their potentials. If placed in the proper situation, what will allow their potential to develop. Everyone has imperfections. But how often in our ordinary lives do we remind ourselves of that? When we get upset at someone because they didn't do what we wanted them to. He says it's essential to be able to distinguish the person from the failure. Because we fail all the time too. Intuition. On most important decisions, there is an information gap between solid information and what is needed. The inherent leadership rests in part on the ability to bridge that on intuition. That is a judgment from the unconscious process. Intuition is a feel for patterns, the ability to generalize based on what's happened previously. The wise leader knows when to bet on these intuitive needs, but they always know that they're betting on percentages. Their hunches are not seen as eternal truths. Again, taking it out of the sphere of his own occupation to anything in life. As he said earlier, the goal of a certain leader is to make others grow. But how do we know if we actually can do that? We don't, right? We have to test and see, and then we have to intuit whether change of or a change of policy or a change of behavior is going to make it. We don't know what's going to work. We probably don't know about ourselves whether it's going to work if we try something, right? So the willingness to have this feel for patterns. During his Jungian phase, he took LSD. Not this before it was illegal. This is when it was actually something that people were studying, and he started seeing a lot of patterns after that. In colors, in the world around him that he said he'd never seen before. He told his family, "Don't tell anyone I'm doing this," and he never did it after it was illegal. But he said he definitely saw that there was something about the doors of perception being opened, right? Whether it's by a spiritual practice or by some substance or whatever. It could help people become more intuitive. Interestingly, Carl Sagan did the same thing, not with LSD. Carl Sagan smoked marijuana, and he actually examined how this affected his, being a scientist, he wanted to reflect this affected his thinking. And he said a lot of the ways that I looked at evidence changed when I had that greater openness that gave me. So maybe other people did that too, but he definitely was intuitive. Foresight, sort of intuition, not looking forwards. He talks about foresight as the ethic of servant leadership. You have to anticipate what's going to happen before it happens. If you don't, that's an ethical failure. Just like in my own experience, in education, we all knew that the demographic cliff was coming. The demographic cliff is when the baby boomer generation, post-baby boomer generation hit, and the number of college-age students in Ohio dropped the second most in the nation. And so we knew there would be less students, and we had to start thinking out ahead of time how are we going to offset that. Colleges that didn't get that, who didn't foresee that, they closed down. We're getting about 1 or 2 colleges closing in Ohio per year now because of that. But again, when you think about who's running an institution, if they're not paying attention to what's coming around the corner, that seen as an ethical failing for me. If you could have seen something, adjusted what you were doing in anticipation of that, you could have protected people from the effects of that change. Foresight. Awareness. That's the last one. To be aware, he says, means to tolerate a sustained wide span of awareness so that you better see it as it is, what he called seeing the whole. Again, I keep going back to the Buddhist teaching about vision, right? Yeah, great vision is like you see things whole, right, rather than from a particular viewpoint. This is basically what meditation does, right? It allows you to see things whole, something that you cultivate. He had one comment on this, which actually I wanted to pull this up. He said, this is the part about routine. He says, the trap that sometimes brings failure to otherwise successful people is to substitute routine for awareness. Awareness is a constant reaching out and responding to everything in the environment. People, the sunset, the sound of the street, the smell of flowers, the cookie clatter, some wheels. It's not tiring or boring. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's the essence of life. So again, when we do our meditation at the beginning of our session, that I don't find that boring either. I think that's we are becoming aware that we are living, and this is what life is. Be able to withdraw into the silence, but don't turn off the antenna so you miss the signal that will bring you back. I think I remember there was an interview with Bruce Lee once. Remember Bruce Lee?
Oh, yeah.
Where he said, martial arts is not resting, but neither is he tense. Right? He is ready, waiting, but in a state of relaxation. And so that's why he was able to put people at 1 inch and drive across the floor. He was able to shift from a state of total silence and total withdrawal into total activity. Okay, so those are the characteristics. Skip through the examples pretty quickly. These are partly based on his own experience, partly on his knowledge. So they're all white men. Right. He was 1957. John Woolman was Quaker, so he learned about him through his experience with the Quakers. So Woolman was a Quaker in the 1700s who was of the fact that his fellow Quakers were all slave owners, and he thought this was incompatible with the human dignity of everyone. But his problem was, how do you convince people who see themselves as good and upright and being slaveholders? How do you convince them otherwise? And what attracted Greenleaf to him is that he didn't do this by trying to legislate, because that got him anywhere. He didn't do it by trying to criticize, rather engaged in this sort of long-standing kind of Socratic dialogue of asking them questions about what it felt like, what did they think about them, how did holding slaves change the way they viewed themselves, what were they giving as a message to their children. He asked them questions rather than criticizing. It took him 20 years of questioning, but in the end, the Quakers said no slavery. They banned it from their membership. So Greenleaf liked this guy as a servant leader because he says he has a clear goal, and he knows that he cannot achieve it by simply, standing this and criticizing them. Does not actually get them to listen. He had to create a listening within their own hearts, and that couldn't be done in a day. So the idea of the servant leaders, the patience that something takes. Same thing with Thomas Jefferson. He didn't say Thomas Jefferson the president or Thomas Jefferson the Declaration of Independence. During the Revolutionary War, Jefferson was spending most of his time sitting at a desk trying to draft a constitution for Virginia, a state constitution. And obviously he wanted it to be a just constitution, one that would abolish all the failings of the British and also some of the failings of the South. But there was so much resistance, so he spent the entire Revolutionary War basically drafting, going to the Constitutional Convention, arguing for it, being rejected, going back, rewriting it, going back again. It was this notion of patience. That once you know what the goal is, you will achieve it. Continue working on it. Last was Nikolai Grundtvig, who was he was a Danish educator in Denmark during the 1800s. This was a time when Denmark was undergoing a kind of industrial revolution too. You had this vast population of uneducated peasants who were again being turned into the cogs of someone else's wheels. And he tried to find a way to educate them to create a sense of community and identity that was previously reserved for the elite who were oppressing them. So basically, he spent his whole life creating a whole culture of education and ended up creating a national identity, more or less, for these Danish peasants. It was all, again, this theme of this long-standing, I can't force people to change. I can create structures that will counteract the structures I want to become. I have to move slowly, consistently. Not very gradualist examples. And there's not the only examples he has, but those ones that begin with yes. Conclusion. Here's the piece. So first of all, he talks about so servant leadership involves thinking about others, and he also talks about communities and institutions. For him, a community is a face-to-face network of human beings defined by what he calls love. Institutions are structures that we create, which tend to be larger than communities in order to fulfill a need that we can't do on our own. And having worked in an institution all his life, he says you need institutions. If you're gonna have a telecommunications network, you need institutions to make that work. So he was very much an institutionalist, but he said there's something that institutions cannot do, and he called it healing. Right? Only community can give the healing love that is essential for health. Human service that requires love cannot be satisfactorily dispensed by specialized institutions that exist apart from the community, that take the problem out of the sight of the community. Think of nursing homes that take the elderly out of the sight of the young, or prisons that put people away, keep them incarcerated, or orphanages that keep people isolated from society. Anything like that is an example that use healthcare systems. Healthcare systems, a problem, right? Okay, what is love? He says it begins with one absolute condition: unlimited liability. As soon as one's liability for another is qualified to any degree, love is diminished by that much. Institutions are designed to limit liability for those who serve. But in human service, where one is served, should be loved in the process and requires community face-to-face, in which liability for each other and for all is unlimited, or at least as close as possible to get from it. The example I use for my students is Giant Eagle. Right? So I get food at Giant Eagle, but they have only limited liability for me, right? As long as I pay my way, they're not required to have a conversation with me and become my friends or anything. That they are there to serve a particular purpose, to sell me something. Nothing wrong with that, right? But he said you can't have a society flourishing with only institutions. And I'm sure we could identify many ways in which community as a form of life has declined in society, in any true living thing. Well, the institutions and structures we create sort of isolate ourselves from one another. He says, this is really the purpose. Why serve others? He says, well, you serve others in order to build love and community, basically. But what about those institutions that we also need, he says? He says, living in the community as one's basic involvement will generate an exportable surplus of love that we may carry each one with involvements with institutions that are usually not. It's like business, churches, governments, and schools. So this is his basic model of society. You can see how it kind of fits with his understanding of the kind of ideals that he's looking at, right? You have to be inside the structures to change them, but you can't change them unless you bring with you that exportable surplus, which you can't have unless you have community. So individuals are shaped by love. community, and that allows them to bring that motivation, that motivating love into structures. And it might take a long time to change those structures, but that's the only way to do it for him. Right? And then he concludes, why do you need certain leaders to rebuild communities? He says, you need another one. There has to be a critical mass. They have to show the way, not by mass movements. Right in 1970 during the student movements and all that, but by each servant leader demonstrating his or her own unlimited liability for a quite specific community-related group. It is our task to rediscover the elementary knowledge of community while we refine and radically improve this vast non-community structure on which we depend on the vast appreciative of survival. I find this to be actually very inspiring because when I look at the news, I get depressed. I mean, when you part of the depression is that we get everything at once that's wrong with it. And the more we see, the more ineffectual we feel. Right? You know, all those, movements out there, all those structures, all those terrible things going on. How can we counteract that? There are many ways, but he says, unless you have this way as part of it, unless this is part of the approach, unless that developing oneself grounded in what he calls love and being able to export that through a particular community, you can't change anything. So what makes him unique, I think, is he's not just, try to make the world a better place, yes. But for him, a better place means you have to change the structures, the institutions. But you can't do that from the top down. Successful. I mean, there are certain things that need to be overthrown, maybe. Persons or things. But doing that is not the solution. That might be a necessary moment. You can't actually read the community. He was actually really critical of Gandhi of all people. He visited India several times and actually worked on their business administration there. He says he was very effective in bringing British rule to an end. But he thought that the particular tactics of nonviolent resistance, he said it was still manipulative. Manipulating the British basically to say, you're not going to hit this person across the face. It stopped the immediate problem, but then you have this nation at war with itself, creation of Pakistan and all that afterwards. So it didn't actually, by itself, solve the problem of creating a unified people. So I found that kind of interesting that he was critical, or at least he saw a limitation to that, even if it might be useful in particular. And so he's very much not a utopian. He's an idealist, but he's a realist, right? And I just find that to be very, very helpful thinking today. Okay. He ends up by talking about, okay, well, what about power and authority, right? It says that servant leaders create power, but it's a different kind of power. It's a power that's used to create opportunity and alternatives so that individuals may choose to build autonomy, to become more autonomous themselves. Coercive leadership, which is how most structures are, individuals are coerced into a predetermined path, even if it is good for them. If they experience nothing else, ultimately their autonomy will be diminished. Right? So again, this is the problem with political programs, right? Let's force everyone to be something because it's good for them. You can force people, but you're not going to develop that way. Right? On the other hand, he says, anarchy is a mess. Most of us are more coerced than we know, but in an imperfect world, authority is still necessary. So here's where he's sort of, he's not a radical, he's not a conservative, but he thinks that sometimes we don't have any other way. The problem with coercive power is it only strengthens resistance, and if successful, it's controlling effect lasts only as long as the force is strong. It is not organic. Only persuasion and the consequent voluntary acceptance are organic. Finally, this is my favorite part of this. Who is the enemy? He says, stupid people are not the enemy. The system is not the enemy, because there are always stupid people. He's a realist, right? Human nature is such that not everyone is going to want to become servants of one another. there would be stupid, but by stupidity simply means people who do things that are counterproductive to liability. So if you get rid of the stupid people, you're not going to solve the problem. If you destroy the system, you also fix the problem because whatever system you put in its place will be filled by people, right? So he doesn't say that you can't change the system, but that's not the ultimate solution. You can't do anything without spiritual internal development of a person. So he says the real enemy is fuzzy thinking on the part of good, intelligent, vital people and their failure to lead or to follow spirits leaders. The enemy is strong natural servants who have the potential to lead but do not, or who choose to follow ignorance. Okay. Last quote from him. This is not from the essay, but this is a part one of his diaries that he wrote at one point. He says, the longer I live, the more I'm convinced that sanctification, becoming sacred or holy, is the purpose of all existence on this earth. This is our opportunity to become saints as much as we can. Every loss, everyone can be converted into gain in this frame of reference. Everything, work, family, friendship, loss, and suffering, achievement and reward as it means to this end, or can become so. Flight after loss seems to be dedicated to this notion, right? Sainthood comes from our best knowledge of what is right, what we should do. One does not do right in order to become a saint. Becomes a saint in order to know what is right, what one should do, and to gain the courage and strength of knowledge. Of course, you cannot know this, right? This is all part of the journey for him, being a seeker. So those are some elements of his idea of servant leadership. Pretty revolutionary in 1970. It's become, now you know where the slogan comes from. But when you actually look who made up the slogan and what his whole worldview was, often people who invoke this idea don't know any of this and have reduced it to a kind of, oh, well, just let's, give people bonuses for volunteering for stuff. No, it's much more than that. It's ultimately for him, it's a spiritual understanding of the person and how we develop those qualities and how that affects others. That for him is, as he puts it, the purpose of all existence. That's servant leadership. Read the essay; it's really good. I mean, he's a very well. He quotes Robert Frost. He quotes all these great authors in it. It's very short and read. They're not too hours, pretty much. Servant as leader, really good read. But ultimately, we want to be able to apply this to ourselves. So if you think now, can you think of any way in your life now, maybe in the past, or even as inspiration for the future, in which you can see yourself in this kind of model that you're trying to grow within yourself some of these characteristics so that others can do the same. For him, the spiritual journey is not simple, it is personal, but it's not private. It's personal because it can only start with a human person, but it is not private because the ability of us to live together on this planet depends on it. When we think of something that each of you does, each of us does, that might illustrate this, that might contribute to it, what do we do?
Think of something that I did.
Or did, that's fine too.
It's kind of a past tense. But I come to that two parts. One is the communication of the goal. What is it? Why are we here? What's our reason for being, and so on. And the experience behind that is that you can never be too precise in that definition. It can't be loosey-goosey. You just want to make more widgets. But if you don't have a precision statement around that, you really can't really measure anything against that. I say we're there, you say we're not, because then you have to argue about it because we didn't define what it is we're trying to accomplish in the beginning precisely enough. So that's something that's always stuck. And I do have some institutional experience and so on around the topic where I have evidence that it works. The other thing that really comes home, and that's the listening aspect of this. You can't overdo that. They put you in a position of recognizing that you don't know it all. You're communicating by listening that, yeah, I really don't know everything. But I have some institutional responsibility for a lot of people, 27 different nationalities, cultural differences, human relationship differences, and so on. These people could be no more diverse.
Yeah.
And being able to work in that private environment required minimum from listening. And it worked. It really worked. In my opinion and so on. And the last thing that you mentioned is it's so true. Again, institutional experience. Your leaders are the ones that people are already going to for help.
Right.
The opposite of that is you know instantly when somebody has been anointed as a leader and he ain't ready for it. Or is not capable. That is so obvious, but like time and time again, if you look at that individual and that's the woman, whatever, that is the leader for the mental organization and they work. Yeah. But the big deal is the listening thing. When you are a minority and in a maybe I was put into a leadership position, not qualified to do it as well. I don't know that Mr. Books would tell. But if you aren't listening, you're going to get nowhere at all. It has to be empathetic, conscious, not, well, I'll just shut up for it. You have to really be listening and drawing from that experience with those individuals.
And it often involves questioning. You have to be asking questions. What do you mean by that? Why is that important to you? Perfect. When you have people who are angry, it's not being listened to. You show that you're listening to them and you're trying to get them to articulate what the source of the anger is. You figure it out. And maybe it can be resolved.
It's easy to fake listen.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's interesting, like all these things, these topics, so awareness and empathy and listening and all of that isn't something somebody has to go with talent. These are skills that we should be taught and learn.
Yeah.
And I think we're missing that so much in this culture, and it's growing. It's both and.
Yeah.
We're missing it, and there's a lot of awareness built around the fact that those are skills that we can learn. And there's trainings that are happening where you can go learn these things. Like, I don't know, like in my work, like part of that is mindful communication. Like what you were talking about. Like, I don't know if you've heard Jim Godin.
Yeah.
They developed like the 4 horsemen of communication. You know what I mean? And it was 4 partnership marriages, so it's quite as well. Same with active listening and nonviolent communication, like, and even DBT skills where there's an acronym called Dear Man, and it's where I get right with myself before I have a conversation with you. It's just like a worksheet that says, okay, how do I feel? What do I need? What am I willing to compromise? You figure all that out before you have these conversations. So anyways, going back to the fact that these are skills that we as humans, so there aren't stupid people and ignorant people. So we think, I don't know, before I started doing this work and when I was younger and less mature, maybe in my 20s, like maybe I saw things like that and thought, oh, I'm just not like that.
Yeah.
Rather than it being a skill that I could learn. What I mean? Like, and I don't know, I think that's what's missing with education. I can probably go on. It's terrific missing on our education systems and if there are health classes, like what it should be involved is, how do we do these things that he's talking about?
Yeah.
I also try to be so anthropocentric and include other things, like the water, the air, the earth, the soil, and all of the decisions that I make are, it's human.
People and life.
Exactly, because kind of like humans have gone like so egocentric that they distorted so much stuff and there's the earth basically is our mother taking care of us.
We see element ourselves.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So that, I mean, even when we talk about when he's talking, I think more in a interpersonal dimension, but he also talk about this awareness of the sun, awareness of this, it's in this holistic understanding, right? And so when we think about, our relationship to the non, we realize that's part of the holistic too. Yeah. And then
I think the word community is very important. I feel like we in some sense, nationally, globally, we've had in some ways we're closer together than we've ever been, more of a community. In other ways, we've given power to people that have made it to be not so much a community.
right.
Like they're only concerned about themselves and their own community, and have forgotten about the rest of the global community. I feel like this is where we're at right now. This is one of the tensions that exist, and to me, whenever like money for so many people equals power, and they've accumulated so much money and power, there's a tremendous imbalance to them.
Yeah.
And I think the only way forward is to get back to more of a sense of community.
Which can only happen from the ground up, right? You can't just say, let's all be a community again.
Yeah.
Like, okay.
Yeah, I was thinking about the term unlimited liability.
Yeah.
And I made a connection in my mind with Brene Brown, and she talks about being vulnerable, having the courage to be vulnerable, and I think unlimited liability, I just heard the courage to be vulnerable, and putting yourself in the arena, even though you're speaking out for truth or yourself, whatever. And it's sort of bottom up rather than top down, and it does ripple out.
Yeah.
And the other thing was, Martin Luther King saw what he did. He learned from that, and he made it. He took the lesson from Gandhi's failure to unite people and took it to a higher level.
Yeah. Unfinished business, as we've seen.
Yeah.
Right.
So there was a pattern that Martin Luther King canceled.
For Bear Ruffalo with Emerson,
Yes.
so which is about nonviolent resistance, and so they read something he wrote. But they also, I think, both of them, Gandhi and Martin Luther King, saw themselves as like fulfilling a destiny.
Sure.
Almost. So we can criticize, but they were just like, I didn't intend to do this. I just ended up here.
Yeah.
And like and if you watch the movie Gandhi, one of the guys says, if I did a hunger strike, nobody would care. But if you do it, everybody thinks. So.
Well, to be clear, again, he doesn't say that there's no room for that. He says there are times when that becomes necessary. Just like he says there's times when he coerces power. There's also times when he nonviolent resistance, that kind of stuff. All he's saying here is that if we say that's the totality of what we should be doing, and we ignore what's going on here, he says then you're going to be coming up short in some way. Again, in 1970, he's mainly reacting to the student movements, saying, well, first of all, he says they're legitimate because they're pointing out things that are wrong, and there's no one leading them. But by itself, just as he said, it's one thing to to criticize and expose the problems. So how do you then become an affirmative builder of a better? So he says it's always. I mean, he never claims to be omniscient. In fact, when people ask him, when this essay came out, everyone wanted to treat him like a guru, and he refused to go. He says, "I don't want to cult me." Obviously that's a misunderstanding of guru. It's a positive as well. He would normally in conversation with people and ask him what they should do. He would be quiet. He would ask them a question, what do you think we should do? He did not claim to have answers, because the whole model that he's presenting here is that the person needs to figure it out. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, when I was 10, I think, some of my first paintings, which wasn't very good, but anyhow, at that point, I thought, I'm going to be a nurse. And it took me a long time coming through, and I was a wallflower when I was young. And I find myself as I've developed through the years that I am around more artists. I'm now becoming I see. And I've joined organizations, not necessarily that I've been wanting to join those organizations. I've been sort of put in position to join those organizations. And I see it making a difference. And I see a possibility of furthering that in community. And then I would give a little commercial to the Canton Museum of Art, because the artists that are showing right now are all women artists.
Yep,
Yeah.
we had the ballet with guys that have come to Walsh and do performance. That was wonderful, and what's her name? Did the interpretation of the art stuff there, yeah. Yeah, but Catherine, like you said, you've been put into these positions. You found yourself here. I'm like that too. I don't think I've had any plan. It's just an opportunity arises. Okay, but in doing whatever you're called to do, you're doing whatever is presented before you. That shapes you with the skills you need to do whatever you were called to do, whatever you need to do without knowing it.
Yeah, and I was going to say that the exhibit that's up right now, and I would be, if
It's great to go see it.
yeah, go see it. It is all women, and it's women who saw themselves, and they were never acknowledged as artists.
Right.
And consequently, doing their work, they were finally, I mean, there's one artist there who changed her name from Claudia to Claude because she couldn't do any art shows. And so that made a difference. And when she became involved, others were able to become women. Last night, I went to the symphony. The woman who was the conductor at the symphony was the first Afro-American conductor on stage in this country, which I thought was really not our symphony. Now she's been all over, but I thought, wasn't that interesting? It took, and she was probably, I would guess, what do you think, added 40-ish, and so it took that long to be acknowledged as a person. And those people make a difference. So each one of us make a very big difference.
So having that long-term view, you have to see how those individuals contributed without achieve anything really. Yeah, my favorite piece from that exhibit, this is called the Shattered Glass, is the one where there's like right the flower vase or something, and the surface of the flower vase of the painting is reflected, and she painted her reflection in it very faintly. That was how she got herself into the picture. So, but again, it's like finding innovative ways to do this. And yeah, I think that is something that is hopeful when I read about this, and when we think of examples like this, is that good things take a long time because whatever the impediment is, it may take generations to change that. We can legislate against it, we can fight against it, but at the same time, if we don't have that organic develop each person making their contribution, whatever is achieved is not going to last really. So I like the idea, but there's basically no shortcuts, right? And we would like there to be, but there aren't, because ultimately it's about this higher notion of being that he talks about in the very first quote. You can't manufacture a notion of being. It has to, you have to step back so it takes place, whatever that is.
And I think what you said about lots of people develop a short, but actually in that evolution, we're learning and we're growing, and so bringing that as along with us as we go.
Yes, that's the community part. Yeah.
To explain, I'm sorry, I don't understand that first paragraph.
So yes, whatever he begins by saying, there is a definition of law, but it begins, I believe, one absolute condition: people have unlimited liability for one another, sense of responsibility for one another. So he uses this. He used this from, again, kind of legal terminology, right? LTD, right? Limited liability, or LLC. limited liability company, where the members of the company be responsible for a certain number of things. But in a community, you're fully responsible for one another, like in a family. Family at least ought to have you're fully responsible for the other person. You don't say, "Well, that's not my responsibility." You're not responsible for all. Responsible for one another, right? That's the idea behind that.
You guys are still kind of confused about love is the news.
So yeah, if you don't treat another person as well, again, how we did this.
So you brought it up in
Chinese.
Bible study.
Well, yeah,
What's the
he
question?
was not, am I my brother's keeper?
Farm question.
Right. Yeah, so if you read the essay, it says, we can't live without an institution. I mean, we can, but we would be going back to the Stone Ages. So there are many good things that institutions and structures and technologies create for us. But if we allow those to take us over and we lose the sense of unlimited responsibility for one another that we have in community, then all that's not going to function. It's going to be dysfunctional.
Could you replace the word love with support and caring for and
Supporting,
nurturing, or you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. I would think so.
love's a really big word. It just
Yeah.
means so many things. Like, I take that as about caring for each other and supporting each other.
When you were talking about the Stone Age, I think that's, in my opinion, in the Stone Age, they learned to communicate and work together.
Right.
Otherwise, you wouldn't have Stonehenge and
Sure.
those sort of things. We've lost that. Is we have gone into
Interestingly, yeah.
So,
Well, I think there's a part here really interesting, is that he's saying that the principles that the people are guided by are really what's important. So it's not just the people that are positioned, but the people's application of those principles. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's when he gives those examples of like John Mullen's, convincing the rest of the Quakers to abandon slavery. He says you have principles, and I'm trying to ask you, are you living up to them?
Right.
But he puts it as a question. You're a bad Quaker, and then he would be not listened to. Yeah. So there's a very thin line between being complacent with something and critiquing something, right? In order to actually get a change that's big, because you have to appeal to the essential goodness of the other person, which is still there, regardless of what they're doing, right? Yeah.
Well, I think we